In today's video we will look at the key events concerning England between 1377 and 1380. To do this we will look at four key events between these years. First we will look at the renewal with the war with France. Second we will look at the Hawley Shackle affair. Third, the crisis over Navarre. And finally we will look at Brittany. Firstly then, we need to look at the renewal of the war with France. The origins of the problems of 1377 can be traced back 40 years previously, when England and France commenced their War of the 100 Years. In the 1350s, England had major victories at Crecy and Poitiers, and it also included the acquisition of Aquitaine, a region of France in the southwest, which you can see on the map to your left. In 1360, the French, after these numerous different defeats, signed a peace treaty of Bretigny, and for over 9 years, France and England had quite cool, cordial relations. In 1369, however, France returned to war with England, and at this point the war was in full swing and the French started to get the upper hand. In 1375 there was a brief respite and there was a peace treaty of Bruges, and that kept peaceful relations between France and England until war was renewed in June 1377, just before Richard II was coronated. The renewal of this war proved to be a major challenge to Richard's minority and to the continual councils. Firstly, between the Bruges Treaty and the renewal of the war, the French invested in replenishing their navy, but the English did not due to a lack of funds. They did, however, try. In January 1377, Parliament organised the collection of a poll tax that was levied at 4 shillings per head of the population. Now that was to finance the construction of more ships, but this was put off until the autumn because of Edward III's death and Richard II's coronation. By the end of 1377, the English navy were completely depleted. Only 5 ships of the Royal Fleet were in commission compared with 27 only 8 years previously. Not only did France have the advantage in terms of the size of their navy, but when hostilities renewed in 1377, the French were effective in simultaneously attacking on 3 separate fronts, and you can see this to the map on your left. In Calais, the English Channel, attacking English southern towns, and also down to the southwest of France, which the English controlled in this area of Aquitaine. The English found that their resources stretched, and subsequently the French had great success in raiding, looting and capturing new territory. That included lots of the areas of red in the southwest of France, so areas like Bergerac. The English responded to this by sending a naval fleet under the command of the Earl of Buckingham. Its efforts, however, were hindered by poor weather and mutiny from within the ranks. Despite this, there were still some successes, so they were able to capture the castle of Brest to relieve an English garrison that was based there. In early 1378, the continual councils decided that they needed to launch a counter-offensive against the French. Extra taxes were used to try and fund this. They'd already been granted at the end of 1377, but subsequent taxes were also put forward by the continual council. An expedition was then planned for the spring of 1378, and it was decided by the council that the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, would lead this expedition. There was a number of reasons for this. The main one was that John of Gaunt was obviously outside of the council's control, and this was a way of making sure that they had power and control over him. But the expedition was a disaster from start to finish. Firstly, Gaunt postponed the departure of the expedition from February until June. Now the reason that he gave was that he didn't have enough ships at his disposal, but the chronicler records of the time suggest otherwise. There was numerous reports that John of Gaunt was seen frolicking around the countryside with his mistress Catherine Swynford, and there's some quite vulgar reports regarding this. The Earls of Arundel and Salisbury decided to leave without Lancaster in April of 1378. The Earls were easily repulsed by the French forces at Harfleur and Cherbourg, and sailed away with little to show for their efforts. When Gaunt eventually departed, he skirmished with the enemy off the coast of Normandy in northern France, before heading west to the town of St. Malo. At this stage he was joined again by the Earl of Arundel, who returned to the conflict, and Gaunt and Arundel and the English forces that were left attempted to mine the walls of the town of St. Malo. Now, this particular process is where the soldiers would dig mine shafts underneath the walls in an attempt to collapse them so that they could gain entry to the town. The problem was that the French army became wise to what was happening, and at this stage they collapsed the mine shafts. Now, Gaunt and Arundel decided at this stage to abandon the siege, and they returned home where they were accused by the councils of cowardice and incompetence. To further compound problems for the Duke, he was also accused of being complicit in the complicated set of events that are known as the Hawley-Shackle affair. The conclusion to the Hawley-Shackle affair takes place in 1378, but its origins date back to 1367. Hawley and Shackle were two knights who had fought with the Black Prince in Spain. When they were there, they took the Count of Denier hostage. Now, the Count of Denier was a senior nobleman in Spain whose family member was actually the King of Aragon, which was a major area of Spain at that time. Now, when they had taken the Count of Denier hostage, they said to the Aragonese that they would ransom him by a sum of 60,000 crowns. Now, this was done in conjunction with the Black Prince, who also wanted some of this money. So the ransom money would be shared between the Black Prince and Hawley and Shackle. So it seems fairly straightforward. The Aragonese would pay the ransom, Hawley and Shackle and the Black Prince would gain a large amount of money. But like most things around this time, things aren't easy, and they do become complicated. The Count of Denier actually replaced himself as hostage with his own son, who was only a boy at the time. Around as well at this time, the Aragonese were engaged in their own conflict with other parts of Spain, and they were unwilling to pay Denier's ransom. The full £60,000 as well was decided over the course of a few years that would no longer go to the Black Prince, and instead the £60,000 in full would be paid to Hawley and Shackle. Now, in 1377, the same year that Richard II comes to the throne, the Count of Denier dies, and suddenly the Count's son, who has been taken hostage by Hawley and Shackle, becomes far more valuable. Now, the English Continual Council realised that they could get some of this money, and claimed that they should take a share of the ransom that Hawley and Shackle had been promised. Obviously, Hawley and Shackle resisted to this, and they refused the council's demands. As a result, they were imprisoned by the Tower of London, but before that actually happened, they hid the Count of Denier. Hawley and Shackle were taken to the Tower of London, but shortly after they were imprisoned, they managed to escape in August of 1378. From here, they ran to Westminster Abbey, which was a short distance away. There, they could claim something that was called sanctuary. Now, this was a special part of law in medieval England, and likewise in other medieval European countries, whereby someone couldn't be arrested if they stayed in a church. Now, this was a very important part of law, and it was something that was never really broken. But the council of the time ordered that Hawley and Shackle be brought to justice, and as a result they sent the Constable of the Tower of London, Sir Alan Buxell, to track them down and to take them in. Buxell and his men stormed into Westminster Abbey and arrested Shackle straight away. Shackle didn't put up much of a fight, but Hawley, on the other hand, resisted and ran to the high altar of Westminster Abbey. When he was there, he was chased by Alan Buxell and his men, and he was cut down and killed in front of a large number of priests that were there at Westminster Abbey. The whole affair was obviously a big scandal for the people at the time, but it also had a number of quite important consequences. Richard and the council decided that Shackle was to be released, and actually he was rewarded with a set of land and money. At the same time, Richard ordered that a perpetual chantry should be put in place in Westminster Abbey to say sorry for the whole affair. A perpetual chantry is something which is in the glossary of the textbook, but just to briefly go over it, it means that a set of priests would pray for the deceased and would say sorry for the council's actions. At the same time, the Count of Denier returned to his homelands near Aragon and took up his princedom. But the main result, and is something that we're going to look at within lessons, is that the Church and John of Gaunt disagreed over the whole affair, mainly about this issue of sanctuary. We're now going to look at the next crisis point for the continual councils, which is in a region of Spain called Navarre. very close to Denia and Aragon, which we've just been talking about. So before we start, it's worth saying that this whole area, which is called the Iberian Peninsula, wasn't known as Spain and Portugal like we know it today. There was a series of individual kingdoms. So Portugal was one of the areas which is still around today. Then there was the larger of the regions, which was called Castile, where Madrid is based. This is an area which John of Gaunt actually thought that he could claim to be king, and it's something that he tried to get throughout his life. The other important area is Aragon, which we've been talking about when we were discussing the Count of Denia. But the area that we need to be aware of is Navarre, which is in the north of Spain, and is actually close to the area of Aquitaine, which we've been talking about when we were discussing the 100 Years' War with England and France. Now, Navarre at this time was ruled by Charles II, but unfortunately his nickname is Charles the Bad, which obviously tells us a lot about this kind of king. Now, Charles and Navarre had been attacked by Castile, and it was expected that Navarre would be taken over by that region. So what Charles did is he travelled to England at this time in 1378 to appeal for help in his own war against Castile. It was a brave tactic for Charles to ask England and the continual councils for help against the Castilians. What they decided was that in exchange for 1,000 troops and for monetary support, that Navarre would give away its territory in Cherbourg, which you can see in the map, so it's highlighted in the light green. England's 1,000 troops went over to Navarre and prevented the Castilians from attacking Navarre and taking it over. But the main results were not the fact that by the end of this conflict there was no major losses. It was the fact that England had gained this town, Cherbourg, which had an important castle. It was a shield to the south coast and could be vital as an important English base. The main problem though with Cherbourg was that it was incredibly costly to run. It cost roughly £24,000 a year just to hold it. Now, Parliament and Commons at the time felt that for Britain to take over Cherbourg at a cost of £24,000 a year, that wouldn't be financially viable, it wouldn't work. But this changed with the Brittany crisis, which took place just after this conflict in Navarre. So not only did Charles II, the Bad of Navarre, appeal to England for help, but also the ruler of Brittany at this time appealed directly to the English crown and the English councils. This happened a little bit earlier. In 1372, John, Duke of Brittany, felt so threatened by the French that he packed up and fled to England. The French reacted at this time by invading Brittany, which was then its own separate kingdom. The only place that was free from French control was the town of Brest, which you can see here on the left. By 1378, the Bretons who lived in Brittany were so fed up with French rule that they appealed to their duke, who was living in England at the time, to return and take back Brittany. The English council agreed to help pay for a Breton army and supply some troops to help out the duke. The way in which they tried to solve this particular problem was to levy a poll tax, and that would raise the money for the Duke of Brittany and his army. Now, you'll see in future lessons why a poll tax is such a controversial bit of taxation, but at this stage it's worth pointing out that every single person in the country was required to pay a set amount of money to help out in this cause. Now, the problem with this particular poll tax was that it only raised £28,000. Now, that was compared to the £50,000 that they actually needed. It was also the second poll tax in only 2 years. So if you think back, in 1377 there was the first poll tax that was introduced when there was the renewal of the war with the French. This was the first poll tax that the continual council set up. The Duke's army, as a result, was much smaller than expected, but the main problem from this Brittany crisis was that disaster struck when the English forces trying to support the Bretons crossed the English Channel. They were swept away from their intended destination and drowned in a storm. There's lots of different chronicle accounts about why this happened, and it's been suggested that Richard Arundel, who was leading this particular force, was struck down by God's will after he had savaged a nunnery on his way to Brittany. Now in lesson we're going to look at these 4 events in more detail, and particularly we're going to look at the chronicle accounts that relate to them. But the 3 questions that we're going to look at once we get into class are the following. How did these events impact on domestic affairs? How did Parliament respond to the demands of the Council? And were the Councils victim to their own bad decisions, or really were they victims down to circumstance? Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the lesson.